Hello, everyone. Today we are here with Janice Bardsley, professor from University of North Carolina, here to discuss a few words of wise with us. Hi, Jan. Uh,
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you for sparing some time for an interview with EJable.
Happy to do this.
Thank you so much. So, Jan, since we want to know more about you, we'll start with a small introduction about yourself and your current engagement.
Oh, I'd be happy to tell you about what I'm doing now. I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I'm retired from the Asian Studies Department of the University of North Carolina. It's actually now the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, so a very broad and active department. My interest has long been in Japanese literature, but also in Japanese performance, and particularly in gender in Japan. So, some of my favorite classes at UNC Chapel Hill were in an introduction to Japanese theater, Japanese literature, but also a course I used to teach called Chasing Madame Butterfly, where we looked at all the stories of Madame Butterfly from the very early Pierre Loti to Miss Saigon. And I also taught a course called Geisha in History, Fiction, and Fantasy, where we looked at the history of geisha in Japan, which is over 200 years, and then also ideas of, quote, geisha girls abroad. And that was one of my most interesting classes.
Oh, that's wonderful to know. So, since you are so attracted to Japan, what was your first encounter with Japan, and how did you feel about that?
Great question. I went to Japan as a college student on a junior year abroad, and I was so fascinated by what I had seen about Japanese art in movies and in art pieces that some of my family members had. But that shows how little I knew about what was really going on in Japan. And so when I first went to Japan, I also knew no Japanese and had no real understanding of everyday Japan at all. So even arriving at Haneda Airport was quite a surprise. And just, it was my first time out of the country. I was only 20 years old. And you just hear a different language all around you for the first time.
Yes.
So that was quite a interesting beginning. And then I went with my student group to Ochanomizu in Tokyo, and we stayed in a ryokan, the Japanese style inn. And
Yeah.
so it was my literally my first experience of tatami mats, eating Japanese food, changing your shoes. I knew to take off my shoes, of course, before going into a Japanese house, but I had no idea there were different shoes. And at the time, you changed your shoes to go into the bathroom, you to go into a kitchen, and this was just really new to me. And I remember shocking everybody by walking out of the restroom into the tatami mat with the same shoes on. And people were all shocked. And I thought, what do you mean I took off my shoes? It's the wrong shoes. So that was the beginning of learning a lot of new things.
Oh, yes. Yes. They are very perfect with cleanliness.
Yeah, yes. And different, it just shows you when you go to a different country, things that you assume everybody does in the same way can be different in that country. It in little things in daily life, even how you fold things, or of course shoes in Japan. The ways you hold utensils, like I began to notice the way women were holding their teacups, for example, like this. And I had never seen that before. So and what's interesting, I think, when you're first in another country for a long time, and I was there first for about 14 months, is the things you absorb that you're not even aware of. That then you notice when you go back to your home country and you realize there's certain things you've just picked up. And of course, That is one of those.
That's interesting to know. Nice. So while you were living here, you must have got some inspiration for writing about Japan and Japanese women. So what was your
Yeah,
inspiration?
I wonder. When I was in Japan first, I was an exchange student. So I took your basic classes in Japanese history and particularly literature, and I had a lot of time. So I read lots and lots of Japanese novels in English translation because I was still a like 101 learner. And I just became so fascinated with Japanese literature from the Pillow Book of Seishonagon up to Soseki and more contemporary writers. And at the time, Mishima and Kenzaburo Oe were fairly new writers, not new writers, but they were kind of current on the scene. And that just has always stayed with me and interested in Japanese literature. And when I was back in Los Angeles, I did a variety of jobs with Japanese companies. I knew I would be interested in Japan after I graduated from college, but I didn't know exactly what I would do. So I went back to Japan and taught English for a couple years at Berlitz. This was before the JET program. And that gave me a longer opportunity to live in Japan and work in Japan. But when I got back to Los Angeles, I worked for Fuji Bank for 6 months. I worked with a travel program for 6 months. I worked with Yomiuri Shimbun for 6 months. So I was trying various jobs to see what fit me. Then finally, I decided, well, if I'm going to be active with Japan for a career, I really need to know Japanese better and more about Japan. So then I enrolled at UCLA and I got into the MA program. And then I was just so fascinated by Japanese literature and culture. And about the time I finished my MA in the early 80s, I decided to go to the PhD program and really make a career of this. And at the time, I had been studying so much about Japan, but so much of the emphasis by the late 70s and 80s was on Japanese men, and it was hard to learn about the history of Japanese women in English. So I decided that I would take up the story of the blue stockings, as they're called in English, or
Yes.
Seito, and their leader Hiratsuka Raicho. The hardest part about that was that everything was in Japanese. The Japanese was Meiji era Japanese, so it was pretty difficult to read. And I think I was still about a third or fourth year student in Japanese when I started all of this. So it was quite a long process. But the motivation was to find out more about Japanese women's history, to find out more about ideas of Japanese feminism, Japanese ideas of women's rights and gender. And I think I spent about 5 years on my dissertation. And then after that, it was a long process to do the book, which is called The Blue Stockings of Japan and came out in 2007, because I translated a lot of the women's essays and short stories, and I found out more and more about their lives. And what I really wanted to do with that book is try to give a piece of Japanese women's history to other English speakers who
Mhm.
would then learn about the variety of women that there were and the different ideas they had and what that meant to be a woman who was newly educated, living in Tokyo, wanted to be a writer in the 1910s. So it was quite an adventure.
Yes. That's amazing. That's really good to know. But you wrote your book in 2007, right?
Yeah.
So have you been in Japan in recent times,
Oh
or
yes, I
was it before
as
2007?
a yes as a since I was a professor, I took students to Japan several times, and sometimes I stayed for a semester with students. Sometimes it was very short trips. But I'd say in the 2000s, from around 2000 to the pandemic, I went to Japan every year in the summertime, and or for study abroad, and or for research or a conference or something like that. Then in 2018-19, I lived in Tokyo for 1 year, and I was a visiting professor at Ochanomizu University in Tokyo. And that was a really wonderful year. I got to teach Japanese students there, and we also talked about chasing Madame Butterfly. And it was so interesting to get Japanese students' perspective on that issue. And I also taught a class on new women and modern girls, and it
Yes.
organized some symposia. And then while I was there, I spent my most of my time doing research for my most recent book, which was called Maiko Masquerade, Crafting Geisha Girlhood in Japan. And what this book is about is popular culture and how this idea of the Maiko, who's the apprentice geisha, a teenager in Kyoto, um, wears a very unusual costume, how she's become a figure of national interest through light fiction, artwork, and most recently manga. So there's a
Yes.
manga about Maiko that's also NHK is made into an anime, and this month it's going to be on Netflix as a live action drama. So I became so fascinated with the idea of why does this apprentice geisha, this Maiko, fascinate people so much, especially because there's not many actual Maiko, only about 60. And even with Geiko, as they're known in Kyoto, geisha, there's fewer than 200. So I was very interested in looking at all the ways that Japanese literature and film, manga, and guides to Kyoto were representing this Maiko as a kind of ideal Japanese girl. So that's what that book is about.
So I was about to ask you about your experience while you were writing the book from your experience of Japan in the recent times, but you answered it all for me already.
Oh, I can tell you more
Yes,
about
please go ahead. I would love
how to,
that.
yeah, because usually since I teach and live in the United States, I would go to Japan most often in the summer and collect materials, Japanese materials, and talk with people related to whatever I was studying. And then I'd come back to the US and write about it. But in 2018-19, when I was a visiting scholar at Ochanomizu University, then I could read and watch movies and so forth and be in Japan. And I was in a wonderful office, Institute for Gender Studies there. So I could always go talk with people, at lunch. Hey, I'm reading this manga and I'm not sure I get this joke. What do you think? And then my Japanese colleagues would be talking about it, and they could give a very different view because, of course, knowing Japanese better and Japanese culture, and could tell me where the jokes were. So that was really fun. And then also, it enabled me to meet people that were related to producing these ideas of Michael. So I met different authors, and also I went and met a famous geisha or two in Kyoto. Although my book's mainly about representation, it was important to get ideas from people actually in that community. So I was able to do that. So actually working and living in Japan while I was writing was very, very helpful, I must say.
That is quite interesting to know. So, since you have visited Japan always as a foreigner and someone from the US as a professor, so you would have some tips for non-Japanese or foreigners to be involved in the local culture in Japan.
Mhm.
So, what tips can
Yeah.
you give them?
Well, I think it really makes a difference to become, even if you're in Japan for just a year or a semester and you're a student, there are ways that you can feel more at home in your Japanese community. Let's say for me, I was teaching in Hikone, Japan. That's in the western part of Japan. And I had some free time, so I did some things like I joined at their lifelong learning center. I noticed that there was a group that was studying Japanese women's history. So I asked to join the group, and it was just 4 women. And they were very surprised I wanted to join, but it was great practice for my Japanese too, and also a way to meet people on with something that wasn't specifically organized as an international exchange. And we became good friends, and I ended up doing a lot of different things in the community, just going to people's homes for lunch or having interesting conversations in the park because I had met these 4 people, and things kind of moved from there. But I also noticed and maybe Hikone was especially good about this, but they would have day-long activities where anyone in the community could join. And it was particularly promoted to international people living there. So, for example, one day I did this. We met at City Hall. We got on the bus. We drove to a variety of locations. There were both Japanese and people from different countries there. And we did activities together. I remember we made soba together in some mountain place. And it was just an overall way to, get to know other people in your community, to know what your community does. I also had the advantage that I was taking students to various places in Japan when I was there. So in that case, we would do things in advance to prepare for field trips and so forth, and we would meet people. And that's maybe not something that's easily done by individuals visiting Japan. But and another very common way, and I think you see this in books about foreigners living in Japan, is going to finding the place you feel comfortable, like the coffee shop you like, or the little store, the little grocery store that, even if it's the convenience store, that you always buy your morning, coffee or something like that. And by or the dry cleaner even. I think the last time I was in Japan, I had a very, friendly thing. I wouldn't say we were deep friends or anything, but we got to know each other on a very comfortable basis by me going to the same dry cleaner, the same family restaurant, the same small little restaurant, and even at the train station, kind of asking questions, just and saying hello when you see the same people, and that makes you feel much more part of the community. I mean, as somebody who's still there temporarily, I imagine for people who are living more permanently, they could use these things, but then they would want to, of course, deepen their relationships. Another thing that I often recommend to people that are going to live in Japan and want to become involved outside of their work in their local community. So what I recommend is follow your hobbies. So if you're already a person who likes to hike or rock climb, or you have cooking skills, or you'd like to take part in Japanese traditional arts, you can find a way into those type of activities without too much difficulty. And because they're visual, such as the flower arranging, for example, or cooking, you don't need to know a lot of Japanese. And if you're doing it by following your hobbies, then you already have a lot to bring to the group. You won't be so dependent on language skills to figure out what you need to do. But along the way, of course, you'll learn Japanese and you'll meet a lot of different people. I think one thing about being involved in the local community in Japan doesn't mean you're limited to only people who are Japanese. There's plenty of people who live in Japan who weren't born in Japan, who are part of their communities. And this can be another way for you to get involved. And you can look for volunteer activities. You'll see signs in various community centers if you visit, or even in your local station, for things that you could do to join. And it doesn't mean that you have to absolutely join forever. Just go once and try it. The other thing I would look for in Japan, and I used to see this in the railway stations a lot, is lots of signs for lectures or art exhibits or movies. It doesn't mean that you have to, let's say it's in Japanese, it doesn't mean you have to understand all the Japanese to enjoy going, especially if it's an introduction to an art exhibit, and then you can look around. and see the art and learn a little bit more. And certainly people are likely to come up to you and ask you why you're there, if you're interested, and you can also engage with other people too. So there's lots of different ways. You just have to kind of look for an opening and take advantage, and some will prove to be very interesting to you, might lead to more friendships, and others are just a nice Sunday afternoon.
Oh, that is all that is so good to know, Jan. I'm glad to have been a part of this interview. I'm sure that our viewers will have a lot to pick up from this conversation and the experience shared by you. I'm thanking you again on behalf of EJable for this wonderful insight. Thank you
Well,
so
thank you.
much.
Thank you, Ankita. I really enjoyed being here, and I'm so looking forward to being able to go back to Japan and myself try new experiences, go to more things, and also try to go to more places in Japan because I tend to go from Tokyo towards Kyoto and Osaka and back, but there's certainly a lot more Japan to see. Thank you
That is
very
true.
much.
Thank you.